All right, so I wasn't sure if I even wanted to talk about this because part of me did not want to give any more credibility to what I think is a very toxic thing that is happening online and on the right. And that is actual, what I would consider actual racism. Now, before you jump down my throat, I realize that the left has categorized everything as racist. They'll just quickly say, this is racist, that's racist, this is racist. And we've been hearing this now, especially since 2016, just racism this, racism that, racism this. But I recently was attacked by a clan, for lack of a better term, a clan of white, I don't know if I would call them white supremacists. I don't think they're supremacists because I think we have to be very careful with the actual terminology. I don't think they think they're better than anybody because of their race. Maybe they do, but I didn't see evidence of that. But I would say that they are white nationalists for sure, meaning they believe the United States should be a white nation, predominantly white. And what had happened was I'm followed by quite a few people who are also critical of Israel, the way that I've been very critical of Israel. And also, there's also a group of people that were very critical of the COVID mandates and the COVID, like what we went through during COVID. And a lot of these people moved to red states, one of them being my home state of Idaho. I was born and raised and still keep a residence in Idaho. Okay, so I'm an Idahoan through and through. And a lot of these people moved to Idaho from more liberal states because they liked the freedom that Idaho presented. They're new Idahoans. They've been there for only, since not like 2020. Well, I got attacked by this group, and they came out in full force. And this isn't totally fringe. I mean, these accounts on X, for example, and on YouTube have thousands and thousands of followers. These are not just people that have a couple hundred like bots, or they have 5 people and they're just saying stupid stuff on the internet. I mean, these are people that have big shows that have a lot of views and followers. They've got a lot of followers on X, and they're pushing a white-only society to the point where they told me, somebody who was born and raised in Idaho, but I'm half Vietnamese, that I don't belong in my own state that they just moved to like yesterday. So these people are brand new in my home state, and they viciously attacked me in droves online. So my reaction to it was after interacting with them briefly, I realized my mistake, that I should have never interacted with them at all, because they literally would retweet me to their followers and then say, like, sick 'em, get her, she doesn't belong here. She's Asian. She should go back to Vietnam. And they just came after me. So I realized my mistake, and I ended up blocking the person I originally, which I don't do that much on X. I don't block people. I don't, but I did this time. I decided to block the person, and I decided to delete all of my interactions with her, because I realized this is getting dangerous. And I'll tell you why I think it's dangerous. Because this group reminds me very much of, I would say, on the left, the trans ideology group, that at one point it was, to me, so fringe it wasn't a real threat. Like, why even pay attention to this? Yes, there's this fringe group out there. I mean, of course, the left is all about LGBT, and then it kind of got ridiculous when they started doing like this, SL2 LGBTKIZX. I mean, it started getting really ridiculous. But to me, it was fringe at the time, and I thought, there's no way this is actually going to take over the left. This is not a real thing. But slowly through time, it did. And slowly through time, we actually saw the left become inundated, and the mainstream left became insane with this highly fringe ideology. And then it started becoming really mainstream. And that, to me, is kind of the trans movement in particular, and this push to transition little kids, and all of that, and guys competing in women's sports and whatnot. That all seemed fringe, small, like it wasn't a real threat, until it just was. And so this group, my fear is I'm seeing this group, and this is kind of what I'd been talking about over these last couple of weeks, that I'd been seeing a overcorrection the right is having an overcorrection to the left's craziness that is turning the right also crazy. And if they don't get a hold of it, it's gonna take over, and it's gonna be just as nutty as the left has been over these last few years. And I couldn't quite pinpoint it, and I didn't really have an example of it until this happened to me over the weekend when I got attacked by this clan. So I'm worried that this movement, this sort of let's not even label it white nationalist, because the minute I say that, you're going to reject it automatically because the left is calling everything white supremacist and white nationalist. But I think our guest actually that we're going to bring on puts it in a better way. She calls it white positivity. Karlin Borisenko is an independent journalist who mostly covers the far left. She's been on the show before, talks about the craziness of the left. She's also the author of a new book, A Brief History of Racism. And she's been trying to tell people for a few years now that there is a distinct difference between those of us who are against the left's crazy critical race theory and how they were pushing that and making white children feel, they go to school and they're being told that their whiteness was somehow that they owed everybody because they were just born white. I mean, it's just insane stuff. And she's been warning that there is a difference between critical race theory, which is looking to replace critical race theory with a meritocracy, which is what we all want. And then there's those who are against critical race theory, but they have a different aim. And that is not to replace it with a meritocracy, a colorblind meritocracy. They want to replace it with white positivity. And if we don't realize that these are two separate camps, then the first can easily become overrun by the second camp. Karlin Borisenko, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, I'm so sorry about what happened to you because I've been through it. I had this exact same thing happen to me about 4 years ago. But part of me is also happy because it's someone else is talking about this, because this is a problem that has existed for a long time. And it's been impossible to convince people this is a real thing.
And it's growing. And that's the thing that I think is the most alarming, is that these people are growing in numbers. I was watching the podcast numbers for this person who attacked me, and the podcast numbers are going up every day. I mean, it's so, and then they were coming after me and calling me a big old lefty. They were saying, they were calling me a leftist, and I was just like a woke person because I didn't agree that Idaho should be, they're saying, well, we want to be in this white neighborhood with whites only, and you shouldn't be here, even though I was the one that was born and raised there. Do you get attacked by them as well, where they're calling you? I mean, you've been critical of the left, very critical. And are they calling you a big old lefty when you bring this up?
When this first started, I actually ended up getting attacked for this about 4 years ago when I was campaigning for an anti-critical race theory bill in New Hampshire. And one of the things I was doing is I was going around to all these Republican groups in New Hampshire trying to teach them what critical race theory was, because at that time, people really didn't know. And when it really became visible to me was when I almost got into a physical altercation with a man that came to one of these meetings that got extremely angry at me because I would not say that critical race theory was, quote unquote, anti-white, because that's the language that they try to force everyone into using. And I kind of stood my ground. I said critical race theory is about the system. It's more about capitalism than it is actually about white skin color. That's a lot of what my book, A Brief History of Racism, is about. But I think that there is this movement on the right that they do want to make everything about skin color, and they do want to build a white only country. And I think that people do need to be aware there are a lot of people on the right who align with a much more toxic view of this than I think people realize. But there are a lot of different tribes in this game. And so the people that you, I think, got attacked by are people that literally do want to build a white society. There are people online that they sit on these Twitter spaces all day. And see, my sun is shining in through my window to make me extra white just for this conversation. But there are people who sit on Twitter spaces all day. They call them, it's called 1488 Radio, where they literally do talk about how much they do not like people who are not white. They use racial slurs as a point of pride. There are some groups that are more toxic in this arena than others. And, I think one of the things that drives me crazy, Kim, is, I know you've been called an anti-Semite for your position on Israel. I've been called an anti-Semite. And, when these things happen, I'm like, there are actually real racists and real anti-Semites online, and they're far worse than anything that Kim Iverson has ever said or I've ever said, or any of these people who are just like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't let Israel, bomb Palestine off the map. And so I think it's important that people know these groups do exist. There are different tribes. They are incredibly toxic. And I think you did the right thing by blocking them and not interacting with them because that's what they want.
Yeah, I realized I don't want this to infiltrate the right the way that insanity infiltrated the left. But I mean, not like I'm one person. It's not like I can really stop them, but I can certainly not help, I think, the situation. And you're right, what they wanted was they want accounts that are larger than theirs to amplify, for them to use us as fodder for growing and gaining more people into their viewpoint. But they're tricky on how they're getting people. I've noticed the same way the left, it was a slippery slope for a lot of people. It was or a slippery slide into, yes, of course, men should be able to compete against women in women's sports. Like if you'd asked a person 3 years earlier if they believed that, they would have said, "Oh no, of course not. I'm a feminist. I believe in women are women and women should have protected spaces." And then 3 years later, suddenly they're like, no, let the man in because he's a woman now too. And he says he's a woman, so he's a woman. I mean, the brain rot happened in real time and we watched it happen where reasonable thinking just kind of went out the window. And I'm starting to see that on the right. I mean, I'm seeing so much chatter, not even from these particular accounts that are calling for white neighborhoods, white nation, be proud of your whiteness, which I don't think there's any problem with being proud of your whiteness. I mean, I think I'm proud of being Asian. I'm proud of being Danish. I love being both Vietnamese and Danish. I love my heritage. In fact, I've only been back to Denmark. I've never been to Vietnam. So I don't have any problem with being proud of your heritage, but they're taking it to a different level. And the thing that I'm noticing on the right is big normal accounts, normal right-wing accounts. It's like because they're against immigration and they're against critical race theory, they don't realize that they're like slowly taking the steps in thinking. Especially, I think we saw this with the H-1B visa conversation when that came out recently. And a lot
Yeah.
of the Indian Americans who are Republican came out saying, "Oh my God, I have never been more attacked suddenly by people that were on my own team."
Yeah, and I honestly think that most of this is the fault of right-wing influencers. I mean, I've been beating the drum for years to try to explain to people critical race theory is not actually about people with white skin color. It has to do with systemic racism, which is more of an anti-capitalist ideology. It's trying to advance Marxism in this country by infusing it into laws and policies, but it actually has never been about physical skin color. In fact, we can look at someone like Cheryl Harris, who literally wrote the paper Whiteness is Property at Harvard Law School back in 1993. And I have her on video saying that this is not about white skin color. Black people can be white too. This is explicitly an anti capitalist ideology. And I think, this is a drum that I've been beating again for years and years and years to try to explain to people on the right who the enemy is that they're actually fighting. And in response, all I've gotten from them is they hate white people. They hate white people. They hate white people. Well, Kim, I've been undercover at multiple far left events where they thought I was one of them. And I'll tell you what, the left at their own events in private where they don't know they're being recorded talk about skin color a whole lot less than the right does. And it's not even close. And so they don't hate white people. It's never been about that. They hate what they call systemic racism, which means the system that upholds racism, which means capitalism in their language. And so I think that the fact that conservative influencers have over and over and over again beaten this into their audience that they hate white people has left this sensibility of a lot of people on the right feeling as though they are a victim of this system. And so what do? They gravitate to the most extreme edges of the system, and they do so deliberately to say the words they're not supposed to say or to have the ideas they're not supposed to have. And sometimes that's fine. I look at groups like Nick Fuentes and the Groypers, who I am friendly with, and they have certain ideas about race, but they aren't cruel about it, and they aren't toxic about it, and there are non-white people in their spaces that interact with them. So that's kind of one group that a lot of people think is driving a lot of this toxicity. I would argue is actually not driving a lot of it. They're actually driving rather common sense conversations about this. But then you have all of these other tribes that are extremely toxic, extremely they get sucked into this and they rile each other up and then they just run around and attack people online. When it happened to me, they were not only going around and trying to destroy any interview I was on, they were like taking over chats, like demanding that I say that CRT is anti-white. They were doing stuff like that online that was annoying, but they also drove by my house. They doxed my house. They doxed my address all online. They posted pictures of it everywhere. And so they do this is a group of people that they are highly ideologically driven, and it is a scary thing to be confronted with the fact that this really does exist in our country.
Well, and not only that, but it's growing. And I don't think people
Yeah.
realize how they're getting sucked into this as easily as they're getting sucked in. But I'm starting to see, it was like incremental. I'm sure there were steps that happened prior to, first it starts with immigration, right? I think we saw that. Like it was like, we have all these immigrants here, they don't belong here. And then it kind of turns into, oh, well, they can't assimilate. Certain groups can't assimilate, so they've got to go. And a reasonable person says, yeah, okay, I don't want illegal immigration in the country. If we don't have sovereign borders, we're not a sovereign country. Like I think yes, we need to do something about our borders. I mean, this is ridiculous. I don't think I would love to live in Italy, for example, but I don't think I could just go and live in Italy illegally and then like they catch me and I still have a right to stick around. I would assume they're going to kick my ass out of there. And I'd be like, well, that's what I got. So I think reasonable people say, yeah, we got to do something about immigration. Reasonable people then say, and maybe there are some groups that it's difficult for them to assimilate because the left, for example, is not requiring them to assimilate. So if they're not demanding, you must assimilate into our culture, and they're able to create these kind of, they're not assimilating in, then that's obviously a problem. I believe everybody can assimilate in. They just have to you have to make effort to assimilate them in. But that's a reasonable person. Then there's like this, then it gets into this, then the H-1B visa. And I see the next logical step. And then people say, well, these H-1B visas, because then we're bringing in all these Indians and it's cheap labor and it's done legally. But then the problem is once they're legal and they're here, then they start bringing in only their own, and then entire companies suddenly are all Indian, right? So then again, a reasonable person says, well, that's a problem. We don't want that either, right? But then the next step, and I'm starting to see this, and this is how it incrementally happens. Then the next step, a person says, okay, well, I want to, I want jobs for white people, okay, because white people need jobs, and they're being taken by all these brown and Asian people, all right? And then I start to see, and I want white babies. I want marriages with whites and whites, and they need to have white babies because we're otherwise we're going to be replaced, and that's where the white replacement theory kind of comes in. And then it's like, now I just want a white community. And I only want to live around whites because it's safer when I'm around whites. And you can't dispute that, because when you look at communities of color, they're just riddled with all this crime. And who commits all the crimes in the cities? It's black and brown people. So I'm seeing this kind of progression where a reasonable person kind of goes from one step to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And then suddenly they find themselves sitting there saying, yeah, I want to live in a 97% white community and everybody else has got to go. I mean, that's
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a difficult situation because I mean, obviously the left has made everything about race for years and years and years in regards to pushing their systemic racism line, which has led people with a very distinct impression, again, that I would argue is false about what they believe. But I mean, it's also that you can't have reasonable discussions about these topics without getting attacked by someone. And so I do think the H-1B issue is interesting because I mean, for me, I'm personally against all immigration. I think there should be an immigration moratorium. I think it should be completely closed off. It's not because I hate immigrants. It's not because I hate Indians. I'm literally married to a Ukrainian immigrant, so I certainly don't hate immigrants. But it's just because I think we're in a situation as a country where we just need to take a little bit of a pause and kind of look at the situation. Now, when I put that out online, I wasn't actually called a racist by the left. I was called a racist by the right. And so it's like, okay, so now we can't even have discussions about what makes sense for this country in terms of immigration policy without being called a racist by one side or another. And I think when you do, because they said that I hated all Indians and that was why I didn't want immigration. Or I mean, it's kind of the same thing with, if you speak out against what Israel is doing in Palestine, you get called anti-Semitic. Well, like anti-Semitism is literally racism against Jewish people. That's what the term means. And so it's like you can't have reasonable conversations about this without being insulted by one side or the other. And I think when you create that sort of reality where you just assume that the reason someone is against something is because they hate Indians or they hate immigrants or they hate Jews or they hate, black people or whatever it is, that is naturally going to push people who want to have those conversations to the most extreme margins of what's going on. And, I mean, I think we should live in a place where we should be able to have these conversations about race. And again, I'm not going to treat anyone differently because of their race. I don't have any sort of feelings about people who aren't as white as I am, even with the sun shining on me. But I mean, I think, we look at things like, the Haitian immigrant thing that happened several months ago, where we are bringing immigrants into this country who have, on average, about a 65 IQ. And I think that it's not a problem because of their skin color. It's a problem because of the reality of, are these people capable of assimilating to this country in a way that we would want them to assimilate, or is this just going to cause problems for us? We should be able to have these conversations without being accused of being hateful people, and I think the fact that we can't on either side is what pushes people to the extremes.
Yeah, I think that is a natural reaction. I think hatred is a natural react. It causes us to then swing opposite. Like if you hate something, and we saw that with the Trump derangement syndrome for years, right? People just hating
Yeah.
Trump so much that even when he said things that they otherwise would have normally agreed with, they suddenly were against things that they just yesterday were for. But then Trump says it, and they're like, "No, I hate that idea." Just insane. And so we just see that pendulum, that overcorrection. And I guess, I mean, are you seeing this? Are you seeing it like I am, that they're growing?
Do I think that they're growing? I'm honestly not sure about that because, again, I think it's an issue of there are many, many different tribes on what I'll call the dissident right that talk about race related issues. Again, I'll bring up Nick Fuentes and the Groypers. They talk about race all the time. And I do absolutely think that Nick Fuentes is getting more influential, but he doesn't talk about it in a hate filled way. And I think that separately from the clips that people might see on Twitter, if people actually watch his content and they listen to his full arguments, they're going to find out he's not being hateful about it. He's not a white supremacist. He has very distinct views, and you can agree with them or disagree with them, but he's not bringing that level of toxicity. So that is something that I do see growing, and I don't actually mind it. I think it's a necessary pushback to some of the, political correctness that's taken over the right, to be quite honest, that doesn't allow us to have conversations about immigration and that sort of thing. But then I do look at groups like, again, like the 1488 radio. I think that is an extremely toxic movement that I do see attracting a lot of people. And if people don't know what I'm talking about, you can find their Twitter spaces almost any day of the week, and you can go in and listen for yourself exactly what they talk about, and it's not good. I do see movements like it was the No White Guilt movement that attacked me several years ago. They actually have they're very coordinated. They actually have like committees of people that go out and attack people and to try to get them to use the anti-white language. And if you don't use it, they do make your life very miserable. Do I think that those movements are growing? I'm honestly not so sure if they are, but they are very loud. And, one of the things as an organizational psychologist by training that I know is that the loudest people in the room will control the message. And so it might be that they just have a couple people now. It might be that they just have a couple people and they all have stock accounts and they're making it seem like they're bigger than they are. But when they're the ones out there that are expressing their ideas, and they're the ones out there that are, kind of taking over the replies and pushing this stuff, eventually it will start to grow if there is not pushback on these ideas.
Yeah, I am just seeing large accounts that are they're maybe not as extreme yet, but like I said, I think it's that incremental steps, these steps that happen, and you just take one step after the other, and the next thing you know, you find yourself completely in agreement. And I do see, a push for a Christian white nation by big accounts that are saying we want white immigrants, or and they're not hateful in the way they're saying it. But they're saying, especially the Christianity angle. I think that there's a lot of people, big accounts, that feel like they haven't maybe taken the step of, look, we're a white nation, we're mostly European immigrants, but they will say Christian, we're a Christian nation. And to me, that is one step because, not all the founding fathers were Christian. Quite a few of them were naturalists, in fact. So I but there's that push, and to me that's like the next step. What's Nick Fuentes's I've listened to him a few times. I find him
Mhm.
funny. I've never found him hateful, though. I've never heard him say, like you said, I've never heard him say anything hateful in the things, and I do find him quite funny. But I don't know if I think there's been a couple of times where I've heard some things where I thought I don't agree with that. That's a definite. But what's his stance? I mean, is he wanting a white Christian country? I think he does, right?
Well, I think he does, and I agree with you. I don't agree with a lot of things that he says, but I think he's very funny, and I think that I don't think he's hateful. I think he's actually very thoughtful in what his responses are. Nick, I believe, does want a white Christian nation, but I think he's also very realistic in that he doesn't want to expel anyone that's not white. He understands there are not non-white people here. I went to Nick Fuentes' last AFPAC event, and there were non-white people in the room, and they were treated very well. And I stood right next to Bryson Gray as the Groypers came up and asked him for autographs and talked with him about a whole bunch of stuff. And so it's, I think his position is that he believes the country should return to Christian values. He does want white Christian men to be in positions of political power and making decisions, but it's not necessarily because he wants everyone to be white and Christian. It's because he wants those values in the country that he lives in, and he thinks there's going to be better decision making if they make it along those lines. I personally am not a Christian, but I'm not actually afraid of Nick Fuentes' ideas because I do think there is some merit to the fact that if we had more principled people in these political positions, then maybe better decisions would be being made. And so it is kind of from my perspective, and I don't speak for him at all, but from my perspective, it is less about Christianity specifically and more about the making principled decisions based on a shared set of values. And I think we can all agree that politicians in our country right now are completely corrupt. They're not making decisions in our best interest. Many of them are bought and owned by Israel. And I think that what Nick is trying to talk about is a balance to our entire government basically being held hostage by a foreign country and saying, we need to bring it back here and we need to be making decisions on an entirely different value structure.
Yeah, I mean, I understand shared values. I think we certainly would want leadership with shared values, but we'd have to determine what those values are, right, before we can
Yeah.
then. And I don't know if it's based on whiteness or Christianity, per se. I mean, like I said, the founding fathers, a lot of them weren't even Christian at all, but so I'm not sure what the common thread is there, and maybe it is. I'm not like going to throw it out and say no, it's absolutely not race related, because race, it's not about skin color, but there is, like, I'm obviously not fully white, but I was born and raised in Idaho. I'm like as Idahoan as it gets. Like and my husband makes fun of me. He's fully white. My husband is fully white, and I am the one that like builds stuff and does, he calls me his Idaho farm girl wife, because I'm the one that's like tying the knots and digging the ditches and building the stuff and doing all the farm type stuff. But so I don't know if it's, I don't think it's race, but it certainly is. But race, usually in groups tend to be from certain areas that have certain values that are instilled in them in certain cultures, and that certainly has an impact. And if you get too many of outsiders into your area, that's obviously going to be influential and maybe not in a positive way. I mean, it's hard to know. I think it could go both ways on that. But yeah, I worry that it's becoming, just like I said with the trans movement on the left. I mean, that was something I literally thought was never going to take hold as mainstream. I mean, I just thought there's no way people are that nuts. And then they were. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think that the answer to this is that we need to have a return to being able to have common sense conversations around issues that we disagree with. I mean, and again, I think Nick Fuentes and the Grippers are a perfect example of this. I disagree with them on a lot of things, but I can actually sit down with them and have a conversation about our different beliefs without getting in a shouting match, without insulting them, without going on a spree where I'm clipping Nick out of context every 30 seconds to make it seem like he's something he's not, right? And so it's like we need to return to that. And you look at groups. I mean, listen, I've been through the immigration system. Like I said, I married a Ukrainian immigrant. We had to be in immigration court for 4 years. I've been through immigration court a lot. And one of the things that was always very frustrating for me about immigration court is I ended up being around a whole lot of people who came here, wanted to live here, didn't want to learn how to speak English, didn't want to learn how to assimilate it all. And that absolutely shaped my views about immigration, where I'm like, I don't mind immigrants coming here to, make a better life for themselves or things like that. But when they absolutely refuse assimilation to the point where, they're creating their own little communities that are separate from American values, in this country, that's going to cause a problem. And I think that that's a conversation that we quite frankly should be having about Indian immigrants as well. There are a mass number of immigrants from India specifically that are being imported by these tech companies that are specifically being imported to replace American workers. And those American workers could be white, black, brown, Asian, like whatever. But the Indian immigrants are brought in by places like Tesla on these H-1B visas to work at a cheaper wage that American workers would be willing to work, and they don't assimilate. And and we can look at, I think there was a report out recently that showed that very few of the new jobs that have been created in the last several years have actually gone to people who were born in America. We should be able to have these conversations without being accused of being a racist or an anti-Semite or being hateful or any of these things, because it's not about hate, it's about reality.
No, I agree with you. We have to be able to have those conversations. I do think people assimilate. I don't think the first generation does. I don't think the people that immigrate here assimilate as easily, but their kids do typically. And from my experience, I feel like those that are born here. But again, it largely depends on what kind of influences they're getting at school. Are they mixing with other groups at school, or is it all one group that's just there and they're not being, then there's no integration or assimilation or whatever. But yeah, we should be able to have these conversations without being called racist. But yeah, what's interesting is that this other group is just as racist as, if not more racist than the left calling people racists, right? That are pushing critical race theory and telling kids that are white that they should feel guilty for their privilege, that they were just born with privilege, right? This other group it's so funny that they're literally the very thing that they say they're against. And they're like the thing that they're doing the thing.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think this is a time for more rational conversation. And this is why for years now, I've been trying to say the left is not talking about skin color. They're just not. They're talking about the system. It's a different conversation. And if we keep pushing this line that they hate white people, that's actually what creates the backlash. So there are real racists and there are real anti-Semites. These things do exist. You've encountered them. I've encountered them. And the reason that they sprout up is because I do believe, have a genuine fear that everyone hates them, everyone wants to kill them, that there's going to be a white genocide. And I think that that is because this line has been pushed on the right for years and years and years, because it creates outrage, and outrage creates retweets and likes and clout and money and all these things. And so I think part of the problem, again, is we need to get back and have a fundamental conversation about who is the left? What does the left actually want? What do they mean when they say the term whiteness or white supremacy or systemic racism? And so that's a conversation that we need to have. And that's what I wrote my book about, to get people to kind of refocus and say, there is actually a problem, but it's not the problem that you think it is.
All right, Carlin, where can people find your work?
Yeah, you can find me over on my Substack. That is Carlin, KARLYN.substack.com. And you can pick up A Brief History of Racism on Amazon in paperback and Kindle version right now.
Do have those links also down below. Carlin, thank you so much for the conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson Show, which has a new show time. Catch the full Kim Iverson Show, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. Head to KimIversonShow.com. See you there.